How do we hear from God? We don't hear God talk to us, so how do we discern God's will? How do we hear what God has for us? You know, when we look at the Bible stories, we all know these fantastic stories about Noah and Moses and the King David and many of the other kings. A lot of characters in the Old Testament and New Testament that we hear these wonderful stories. And in many of these stories, especially in the Old Testament, God speaks. God speaks just like any other person would speak. And it's like God is just another character in the story, you know. But one person says this, God says this, then they say this, God says this. It's just like a conversation. Isn't that interesting? And not only that, but God seems to let his will be known to people in very particular ways. I mean, there's no mistaking this when you see a pillar of cloud, or a pillar of smoke, or a pillar of fire. You know when God wants you to move, right? And so there's no guessing, gee, does God want us to move? Well, this huge pillar of fire is moving, so I guess we better follow. Or when Moses stumbles upon the burning bush, but the bush is not burning up. Boy, it doesn't get any more clear than that, but you're seeing something out of the ordinary, and God is calling. And yet, so often that's not what we experience. We don't experience that sense of clarity. We don't experience that audible voice of God. And so why is it that God spoke so often, it seems like, in the Old Testament and in the Bible times and not now? Well, first of all, we want to acknowledge that there were times in the Bible when God didn't speak very often. And in our story, that in 1 Samuel, we hear about a time when it said that there were not many visions from God, and God did not speak. They did not hear from God, in other words, very much. Samuel was a boy. We're not sure how old he was at this point, but he had not heard from God in his lifetime. So it had been a little while. Just to give you some background on Samuel, he was a child he was a miracle child. His mother, Hannah, struggled for years with infertility. She prayed to God that she would be able to have a child, and if she did, she would dedicate that child to the Lord. And so she had a child, and she dedicated him to the Lord, literally. After she was done nursing, Samuel went to live with Eli the priest and to learn the ways of the house of God. And so he lived with them. His mother would come and visit every now and then. So he's living with Eli, and we hear this humorous story, about how he's sleeping and he hears a voice. He assumes it's Eli. He goes in, says, "Oh, Eli, you called. What do you need?" Eli's like, "No, I didn't call. Go on back to sleep." This happens 3 times. By the 3rd time, I guess both are probably frustrated with each other. Eli's like, "Samuel, go to bed," And any parent can relate to that. And Samuel's probably frustrated with Eli. It's like, "Well, somebody's calling me, and you're the only one here." But Eli figures out that it must be the voice of God. It's not him. And so he says, "Just go say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Oh, if it were that easy. Wouldn't that be great? If all we had to do, we want to hear from God, just say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." That would be easy, wouldn't it, if we could just do that all the time? But times were different then. And nowadays, though, we don't want to limit God and say God can't do things like that. There have been stories of people in the U.S. and abroad who would swear up and down that they heard the voice of God. And if it wasn't audible, it was at least audible to them in their head. It wasn't just like an impression or an idea, but they actually heard a voice. I've read a story about a guy who one time when he was receiving communion, he heard a voice say, "I knew you when you were 10, I was with you when you were 10, and I'm with you now," or something like that. And it freaked him out. He didn't know what to think of that. And so we do know that there are people who have experiences that it's hard to argue with their experience, that sometimes God can do that. But by and large, I would say that the vast majority of people have not experienced that, including myself. And so it seems as though that's not God's main way of working. And so how do we hear from God? Or how do we have a conversation with God if he doesn't speak to us audibly? Well, first of all, if you want to hear from someone, you have to listen, right? We have to listen. There's such a thing as active listening. Active listening is different than just listening. So listening, you can have someone talking to you and you can be saying, and not know what they're saying. Or you can be multitasking, right? You can be doing something else, so you're only kind of sort of paying attention. And so you're listening, but you're not actively listening. Active listening is when you put down the remote or the paper or the book or whatever it is, and you put 100% of your attention on the person talking to you. And you're listening not to respond, right? Oftentimes we listen as we're formulating a rough draft of our response or our rebuttal or whatever it might be. And instead of active listening, we're not seeking to respond, we are seeking to connect. We are seeking to know the other person. And so before we want to get our point across, we want to make sure we understand the other person and their point of view first and foremost. And then, after we understand their view, and we make sure, we check with them, and we make sure that we do understand them, then we can give our perspective. But active listening is where you're seeking, there's no objective, you're not seeking to manipulate or to try to get something. You are simply listening to connect and to know the person. This is important in any relationship, and this includes our relationship with God. Many marriages that end in divorce because of a lack of communication. Oftentimes there are issues simmering beneath the surface, but they don't talk about them. And so then eventually, what happens when something simmers too long? It eventually boils. And so in the same way, issues that are not communicated will eventually rise up. And oftentimes what happens is one partner will say to the other, I'm done. We're going to get a divorce, and the other person's like, what? I thought everything was going fine. What's going on? Oftentimes what happens is things were going fine, but there's been a lack of communication. Or maybe there has been communication, and one partner has talked to the other or has tried talking to the other, but they don't feel heard because they're talking to their partner, but their partner is not listening, actively listening, seeking to understand, connect, to see their point of view. And so communication is very important. Active listening is very important in any relationship. With our relationship with God, what does that look like? Well, again, prayer is our go-to method of connecting with God. Prayer, oftentimes when we think of prayer, we define it as talking to God. Now, sometimes we multitask when we pray, and that's okay. Sometimes we're busy, and if you're going to pray at all, it's going to be when you're multitasking. And there are some things that we can do in life that are relatively mindless. We can, maybe when you're doing something, maybe it's a hobby, maybe if you like to do crocheting or something like that, now for me, I'd have to concentrate 100% if I tried something like that. But for some people who know what you're doing, you can do that, and you can think about other things. You can pray while you're doing something else, and that's good. But if we only pray while we're doing other things, it will be less likely that we will hear from God. Not saying we can't, but it'll be less likely unless we have some times when we're focusing on prayer. We're actively praying. In other words, we're actively listening. And also, our prayers can't be just us talking all the time. With the preaching that I do, I talk, and I talk, and I talk, right? And you don't say anything in response so far. But that's the way it works. That's just the method. This is not conversation, it's preaching, and it's different, right? But if we go that method with prayer, and it's just us talking and talking and talking, but we're never spending time in silence. We're never spending time just being still and trying to clear our mind, trying to empty our mind, then we're preaching to God, right? We're preaching to God. We're telling him how to do his job. We're saying, here's what I want you to do for me, and here's what I want you to do for other people, right? We do it out of good intention, and that's a part of prayer. But we also want to know we don't have to talk all the time. Okay? God knows our needs before we ask, so we don't have to talk all the time. We don't have to feel so urgent all the time. We can spend time in silence. Now that's going to be hard because we're not used to doing that, so it might be a short amount of time before you work your way up. And it depends somewhat on your level of busyness too. But if you can spend some time being still, being silent, there is such a thing as Christian meditation, and sometimes prayer and meditation, there's a thin line between those two. When you're seeking to connect with God, emptying your mind, connecting with God, it's a discipline. It's not easy to do, but there's more of a chance that we will hear from God. Now, it's not a guarantee that we will. So if you go in and you sit down and you just kind of close your eyes or whatever you do, and if you have the mindset, I better hear from God today, and then you think, am I hearing from God yet? You know, it's kind of like when you go to bed at night and you say, I better be able to go to sleep soon. Gotta get up early the next morning. I need to go to bed. I need to go to sleep soon. And if you think about that, guess what? You're not going to go to sleep soon. And so the same thing with prayer. We can't be going with the objective. See, that's where we're wanting to get something from God. And remember, active listening is when we're not. Our only objective is to connect with the other person. And so prayer, the objective of prayer is to connect with God. And so we just go with an open mind. And so you might get an idea or an impression. You might have a feeling come over you that you don't know where it's coming from. You might feel called towards something. It might be an action, something that you need to do with your life. And these things can happen even when you're not being still and silent. They can happen when you're doing other things. They can happen sometimes when you're not even praying, right? We don't limit God. It's just that there are certain things we can do that make it more optimal for that. So we know the importance of prayer, but yet so often we wish it happened like Moses, right? We wish that if God was going to speak to us, that he would just do it while we're working. We're just working, we're doing our own thing, and there's a burning bush. And wouldn't that be great? That would be so easy, wouldn't it? But what do you do when you get an idea or an impression or a feeling or you feel like you're called towards something, but you don't know for sure if it came from God or not? How do you know if it came from God or if it came from your own mind or if it had something to do with what you ate last night? You don't know for sure. And so you want to do what you can to discern. You want to do what you can to find out. With most things, there's not a lot of urgency, and so you can spend more time in prayer. You can look at the scriptures and say, is what this is, this idea, this feeling, is it in line with the teachings of Jesus? Is it in line with what Jesus taught and how he lived? Is it, does it make sense? Is it according to the way of God? And then you can sleep on it if you need to. Sometimes we can think about it in a fresher way the next day. Another way to discern is to talk to other people. That can be scary, right? Because what if they reject your idea? But talking to other people, particularly people that you trust, could be people in your family, could be people in the church, but if you talk to people you trust, then they can either confirm that, affirm it, and say, yeah, I think that's good. I think that could be from God. That could be something that you're called to do. Or they could say in a nice way, I think that maybe, have you thought of this angle? Or have you thought about this? Maybe they can point out some of the things that might be a sign it's not the way to go. But talking with other people can help affirm or kind of change your call. It can help inform it. In the Methodist Church, when people are going through the process for ministry and ordination, that's why they believe in the confirmation of a person's call, and that's why candidates will meet with a district committee of ministry and a board of ordained ministry, and they'll meet with a group of other people going through the process, and they have a mentor that they meet with 6 times a year, and they have all these different things, and before that, at the very beginning of the ministry process, a person meets with their local SPRC committee, and they get to know them if they don't already know them, and they talk. And eventually the church at a church conference decides whether or not to approve this person to start the candidacy process for ministry. So there's a lot of places in that process for confirmation of a person's calling. And so we want to remember the importance of asking other people. Because it's not just a calling into ministry that you might want to seek other people's advice for. It could be anything that you're called to. So that's one thing. And then finally, after you have done these things, eventually you have to act in faith. I've heard it said before that one pastor said he's not 100% sure God's called him to do anything. 100%, maybe 97% or 98%, but not 100%. And so we want to realize that we can't be certain about everything, and if we wait for certainty before we act and do anything, we'll be waiting a long time, right? Oftentimes it's only when we look back and we can say, yeah, that was definitely the right way, or no, that was definitely a detour. And so, but eventually we have to act in faith, otherwise we could be waiting forever. Certainty, when it comes to God's general will, we know God's general will for all of us. The greatest commandments, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And so with a lot of things you can ask yourself, well, is this in line with the greatest commandments? Does this seem to be loving towards God and loving towards other people? If so, then there's a good chance that it could be God's calling for you, or at least it's not a bad thing. And if it's not loving towards God or loving towards other people, well, then it probably didn't come from God. But we have to go in faith with anything more particular than that, loving God and loving others. When it comes to very specific particulars in life, you just don't know for sure 100%. All you can do is discern to the best of your ability. And when you spend time in prayer and in Scripture, when you've talked to others about it, when you spend time, then you have to act in faith. I think I've shared this story before, but I remember when I was trying to decide, I was in Missouri and I had some churches that I was preaching at part-time, and I was deciding whether to go to a certain seminary that with that seminary I'd be able to stay there, or go to a seminary that I wanted to go to anyway, but it was further away. And so I was praying about it and praying about it and praying about it, and one day I said, God, you're going to have to give me some kind of sign, because I'm just not going one way or another on this. And then I got a call from the district superintendent that day saying there was an anonymous donor who would pay for my seminary if I stayed at those churches. I took that as a sign, and so I stayed at those churches for 3 years instead of 1 year, and stayed as long as I could. I had to go finish eventually, but now looking back on that, I still say, was that a sign from God, or was that coincidence? Because there are such things as coincidence. I don't know. I'll never know for sure. And the other question is, with some things, does God care whether I went to that seminary or that seminary? Or would it have worked either way? It definitely would have changed things. It would have changed my life in different ways. But, what I'm saying is that I think that with some things in life, if you're trying to discern God's will, but you're going with basically you're 95% sure or something like that, if you end up going on a little detour, God is amazingly flexible. And so God is able to work with the detours, so that even if you go off on a little detour, oftentimes God can either get you back on track, or that detour becomes a part of your journey. And God has to be flexible, because we have free will. Right? So if we make a choice that maybe is not God's best for us, it doesn't mean you're messed up for life. It means that maybe you've gone off course, or maybe you've gone on, with some things in life, it's like, well, I could do this or I could do that, and either path will get you where you need to go. So I think that when it comes to figuring out God's plan, don't give yourself a headache trying forever to figure it out. What you do, you discern to the best of your ability, pray, read Scripture, talk to others, think about it, and then eventually act in faith, knowing that God is with you, and if you make a few mistakes along the way, if you do it in good faith, and you do the best you can, I think God is okay, and God honors you for your faithfulness. And God will continue to lead you and guide you. Just keep your ears listening and pay attention to the best of your ability.